Hello, BookTube. We've now reached the end of our read-along for 2018 of Homer's Odyssey. The story ended last time with Odysseus finally home in Ithaca after 20 years, and disguised as a miserable beggar by Athena, who wants him to sort of reconnoiter his old kingdom and his old palace without being recognized by the crowd of gluttonous and loutish suitors who have been infesting his hall for years, hanging around waiting to marry his wife, Penelope, who they assume is his widow. They've been eating up her stores, they've been drinking all of her wine, and she's been putting them off with one ruse or another while they mock her and mock her grown son Telemachus, and assume loudly that her husband is dead and has been dead for a long time. In other words, a pretty grotesque violation of the sanctity of hospitality. And a kind of slow-motion, sotto voce insurrection against the kinghood of Odysseus. Odysseus, in disguise, allies himself with his old swineherd, Eumaeus, and he eventually reveals himself to his son Telemachus. But he is still, as far as the suitors are concerned, a disgusting beggar in the hall. And they treat him contemptuously, and that's where we ended last time. This time, these last 6 books are the climax of the whole story. People who aren't really familiar with the Odyssey as a reading experience, only as a retelling experience, just reflexively sometimes think that it's a story about the Cyclops or the Sirens or the Scylla and Charybdis or something like that. When really these 6 books, these final 6 books in our read along, are the climax of the whole story. This is the ultimate revenge saga that made a template that has been followed forever. Hollywood would be lost without the final 6 books of the Odyssey. And in these 6 books, the deliciousness of revenge has to be just brought to just a bubbling pitch by the poet, or it won't work. Or the last thing you want to do when you're telling an audience a story like this that's entirely hinging on a massive spasm of revenge is for them to come away thinking, oh, you missed an opportunity here, or you missed an opportunity there. That's bad. And Homer doesn't miss any opportunity, including the masterstroke of the means of revenge itself, the great bow of Odysseus. Again, keep in mind, Homer assumes what everyone at his time assumed, at least artistically, at least rhetorically, that the previous generation is always stronger, tougher, smarter, wiser than the generation currently, and so on and so forth all the way back. And so the great bow of Odysseus sits in his hall, but the suitors can't string it, much less draw it. They can't use it. It's too tough for them. And they set up a contest of axe heads, just a row of axe heads. So basically a long telescope of $50 sized holes that can someone not only string the bow of Odysseus, but shoot an arrow through all those axe heads. So not only strength, but skill. And that is what brings the revenge story to its fever pitch, because not only do these loutish suitors not know that they are taunting Odysseus himself in his own hall, but they hand him the weapon with which he will kill them. They let him do it. Because they assume they're in no danger. They don't have any idea what's going to happen. And sure enough, he passes the test, of course. He's a very skillful archer. And then proceeds, with the help of Eumaeus, the swineherd, and his son, to slaughter the suitors. It's compared to livestock slaughter. It's compared to hunting game. It's compared to fishing. It's just a wholesale slaughter. He has taken the precaution ahead of time of hiding their armor and weapons. So he and his son and the swineherd basically kill a hall full of defenseless men. And it's written at a pitch that exists nowhere else in this book. I think, in my opinion, it's the only part of the Odyssey that sounds like the Iliad. And when they're all dead, when all the suitors are dead, the bodies are still in the hall. No attempt is made to honor them in burial. No attempt is made to do anything like that. When they're all dead, Odysseus and his son go to the upland farm of a miniature schnauzer. They go to the upland farm of Odysseus' father, Laertes, an old man. And Odysseus wants to... Classical pup. Odysseus wants to see if his father will recognize him, which is kind of silly, because he's... it's over now. The story is going to spread. There's only one person who could wield the bow of Odysseus, and he's already done that. But when he meets his father at his father's farm, he once again lies. He once again tells stories about himself. And then reveals himself. And the do you mind? The three men and their aides and the swineherd all settle down to a meal, knowing that trouble is brewing, because as commentators have pointed out for thousands of years, and as a character points out in the last book of the Odyssey, Odysseus has now robbed Ithaca of 2 generations of men. He took the flower of one generation away to war, and keep in mind, lost them all. He came home alone, no crew. They all died. And the sons and nephews and brothers of those men that he took away to Troy, he has now slaughtered to a man in his own hall. So there's civil war brewing in Ithaca. And it's only brought to an end by brute force. They are having a meal. Odysseus tells someone to check the door. They see that an armed force is coming, comprised of the kin of the suitors, who are utterly outraged. And they suit themselves up for war. 3 generations of a father, a son, and a grandson, Laertes, Odysseus, and Telemachus, all suit up for war and lay in. They charge into these crowd of the suitors' kin. And we don't know what would actually happen, because the goddess Athena steps in and forcefully puts an end to everything. Tells everybody to drop their weapons, including Odysseus, her favorite. Tells them all, just by main force, drop your weapons and stop fighting. Make peace. And although the poet makes sure to tell us that she's in disguise as a human named Mentor, a human named Mentor yelling out, "Hey, let's stop fighting and make peace," after swords have been drawn, after blood has been drawn, would be ignored or cut to pieces. It's obviously not a human who gives this order, and no one thinks that it is. Their weapons fall from their hands. The shout it pierces them all. They know perfectly well that they are being ordered by a god to stop fighting, and so they do. And that's the end of the Odyssey. That is how things end. Now, there are threads that run throughout here that I think are very interesting in these last 6 books. These last 6 books are, of course, not just about revenge. They're also about recognition. They're about, as Odysseus' return to Ithaca has been from the beginning, they're about ceremonies of recognition. Who knows who he is when? The last time we saw, he tells an enormous, elaborate lie to his old swineherd and then tells the truth. He reveals himself to his son. We saw that his old dog Argus, recognizes him, despite the disguise put on him by a goddess, and knows him before dying. And in this book we get even more recognitions, the most poignant of which is, of course, Odysseus and Penelope, his wife, the wife that he's been striving to return to for 20 years. But we also get a very concrete moment when his old nurse, Eurycleia, is washing what she thinks is just a filthy beggar. She's doing it as an act of hospitality and kindness, and she spots a scar. And she recognizes it perfectly well. She knows right away, you're Odysseus. You're not a beggar. It turns out later on that it's that scar that he uses to identify himself to his father as well. He doesn't show that scar to Penelope. There is an elaborate game going on, I think, in the scenes between him. First, there's a long scene where he tells her a lie. He tells her a fake story about his identity, about who he is, about his past, about having run into Odysseus in that past. And she gives responses, heavily mannered, in my opinion, responses about Oh, how happy I would be if he were to return. Oh, how hard it's been being faithful and loyal to him this whole time. I believe there's a lot of telegraphing going on. I don't think there's a single person in Homer's original audiences who wouldn't have known what was going on in that scene. The main thrust being that Penelope recognizes him immediately, and that there's an enormous pantomime going on here. But there's also a formal recognition scene, too, between them. And, there's the recognition scene with Laertes, and all of that is fascinating. All of that is part of the long payoff of this book. A huge part of the long payoff is the building anticipation of a massive revenge. And the other part is, what is the homecoming itself like? What will the homecoming itself be like? You've been gone for so long. Will anybody know you? And what will they think of you? I think that's fascinating. And that runs all throughout these books, and is done so well that almost any translator can manage to carry the thrill of it. And the other thing that I just want to leave off this my own comments with is the totally uncertain ending of this poem. People think, yeah, it's a story about Odysseus who goes to the Trojan War. He fights for 10 years. Then he takes a long time wandering to get back home. And when he finally gets home, there's a familiar anecdote about the bed that he shares with Penelope, and the image in those retellings, but not in the poem itself, is of happily ever after. And the implication at the end of the poem couldn't be any different. I don't believe that you can get to the end of the final book of the Odyssey and think that the kin of the suitors are reconciled to Odysseus at all. If anything, they hate him more than they ever did. They have been forced to stop fighting him by a greater power, by a deus ex machina. But they have not been reconciled. They have not forgiven him, and he has not forgiven them. So I know that you're not supposed to be thinking it, but I do wonder what will happen in Ithaca in the next 10 years. What kind of a kingdom will Telemachus inherit? if he helped to kill the sons and brothers and nephews of everyone, of all the property owning, tax paying men in his kingdom. What kind of a kingdom is that when everyone hates you? It's the tricky thing about relying on the beneficence of the gods, is that they often look away. They aren't always helping. So does Odysseus get a knife between the ribs a year after the end of this poem from somebody when Athena is off doing something else? I don't know. I'd be curious to know what you think. Actually, now that we're at the end of our Homer along for the Odyssey, I'd be curious to know what you think of the whole thing. You have now gone through Homer's Odyssey. Some of you for the first time. Many of you for the first time as an adult. Certainly, I think it yields, of course, or I wouldn't read it every year, I think it yields a bounty of stuff every time you reread it, no matter how familiar you are with it. And I'm curious to know, a lot of you fall all along that spectrum, and I want to hear it. I want to hear it all. We're done with the Odyssey now. So what did you think? Especially of these last 6 books, but of the book as a whole. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess. It's been my experience with more students than I can count. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that pretty much all of you preferred this to the Iliad. I did my best with the Iliad. I will try again next year. but even so, whether you did or not, I want to hear it all. I want to hear everything you think about this book. Now that we're done with the Odyssey, we read the Odyssey in August, and for the first time in my life, I read the Odyssey in August every year. And for the first time in my life, I had company, and that felt great. So that ends the Odyssey, and that will leave us all wondering, what are we going to do for September? We still haven't picked a book for September. There's a lot going on in September. There's ShakeTube, for instance, and there's also, for 12 lucky people out there, there's a mandatory buddy read of Brewster's Millions. But that still leaves us. That still leaves our read-along here on this channel. And I decided on something. I decided on a book. But I don't think it's for all of September. I think we can probably do it in 2 weeks, and then pick another short book for the last 2 weeks of September. The book that I picked is 120 pages long. That's 50 pages a week. I don't think anybody will have trouble doing that. I have very seldom met anyone who didn't read this book in one sitting because it doesn't let you go. And that is, we're going from 8th century BC to 1887. This is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the story that introduces Sherlock Holmes to the world. It's a tiny little thing. It's comprised of two parts, two big parts. I would suggest that we read the first part for next Saturday. So that would be. I wonder if I have an itemized table of contents here. I have 80 million copies of this thing, and they're not all arranged the same way. Let's see here. Yes. Okay. So part 1 goes from chapter 1, which is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, all the way to chapter 7, A Light in the Darkness. I would suggest that we read that part 1 of A Study in Scarlet for next Saturday. A lot of you have read about Holmes. You've certainly seen pastiches, whether it be the movies or the great BBC production with Jeremy Brett or the great BBC production with Benedict Cumberbatch. And probably some of you have read bits and pieces of stories or maybe individual stories, but I say we go through A Study in Scarlet carefully as the first of the Holmes books. But even so, we're not going to need a whole month to do 120 pages. I mean, I have philosophically reconciled myself with how slow the rest of the world reads, but please, I think you can do 120 pages in 2 weeks. So we'll do part 1. I should have held it out here. Part 1 is 60 pages long. So we'll do that for next week. Part 1 of A Study in Scarlet. And then the following week we'll do part 2. I must warn you ahead of time, as fans of Sherlock Holmes have been pointing out forever. Part 2 of Study in Scarlet is a little bit tougher going. If you haven't read it, you'll see why. It is. It was not the first drastic, dramatic, rhetorical mistake that Arthur Conan Doyle made, nor would it be the last. You have to love it because you have to love Sherlock Holmes. But nevertheless, we'll do that, and then we'll do part 2 for the second Saturday in September. But September, if I remember correctly, has 5 Saturdays. Next Saturday is September 1st. So we'll do. I think I remember that correctly. I could have that wrong, but one way or another, we'll do this for the first 2 Saturdays in September. And then, while we're doing that, we will pick another short work. If September has 3 Saturdays left in it, then we'll pick something a little bit longer. If not, we'll pick something every bit as short, a tiny little thing. So, pull this off your shelf, or go to your local charity shop and buy a $1 copy, or download it from Project Gutenberg, and we will do A Study in Scarlet next Saturday. So there you have it. So we have the Odyssey, and we have Sherlock Holmes. So we're not straying far from Steve's comfort zone, but I want to hear it from you. So let me know everything about the Odyssey, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.